Around 12:30 a.m. on April 17th, 1974, a girl was walking towards the train station. Along the way, three men from the U.S. Army asked her for directions. As a token of gratitude, they invited the girl and claimed they would drive her home. The girl agreed, but after she got in the car, they held a knife to the girl's throat and drove to a remote field. The girl was brutally sexually assaulted. One of the men even took photos of them sexually assaulting the girl. Then, they drove the girl back to her home. This poor girl had no intention of keeping silent. On the contrary, she came up with a good idea. Before getting out of the car, she pretended that she was interested in a violent sexual life and asked them for their phone number, hoping to continue next time. After returning home, the girl first cried in her room to release her tension, then reported the attack to the police. Following the police's instructions, she lured one of the men, named Lonnie David Franklin Jr., to the train station. The police were hiding there. As soon as they spotted the man, they immediately rushed over and arrested him. As time moved into the 1980s, the Los Angeles Police Department, under public pressure, established a special task force to investigate a mysterious individual known as the South Side Slayer. From 1983 to the end of 1985, at least 13 sex workers were inexplicably stabbed and murdered. Due to the similarity of the victim group, they were all black women who had a long history of drug use and engaged in sex work. Before their deaths, they were sexually assaulted, then killed with a handgun or strangled with a rope, and finally dumped on the streets, alleys, or in garbage piles in South Los Angeles. So, the detectives were convinced that these murders were committed by the same person. However, most of the victims were poor women, black women, drug users, and sex workers. Early on, almost no one cared about their lives. It was not until September 1985, when the death toll reached more than a dozen, that the LAPD described these cases at a press conference and asked the public for clues. In January 1986, the number of murders identified as committed by the Southside Slayer had risen to 15. The LAPD increased the number of detectives involved in the investigation of this case. However, there was no information about the killer. As a result, angry people formed a group called the Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders. In March 1986, they collectively pressured the Los Angeles City Council, demanding that they value life and increase the reward for information leading to the killings from $10,000 to $25,000. By the end of 1986, more and more victims were being discovered. But conflicting modus operandi and suspect descriptions led investigators to question their initial belief that there was only one killer, and evidence indicated that there were multiple serial killers. In South Los Angeles at the time, at least 4 of whom were beginning their murders. In 1987, the special task force investigating the Southside Slayer began to downsize because it had spent a lot of money and manpower without achieving results. In the following years, the police found that several murders committed by 5 serial killers were included in the Southside Slayer serial murder case. And in addition, some murders were found to have been committed individually by pimps or clients of the sex workers. However, the original killer was never found. While Lonnie was arrested by the police, he was charged with sexual assault and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 40 months in prison. Less than a year into his sentence, on July 24, 1975, Lonnie was discharged from the U.S. Army. After being released from prison, he worked as a sanitation worker in Los Angeles. For him, he was well acquainted with the locations of the city's alleys, garbage bins, and dumps. On August 10, 1985, the body of Deborah Jackson, the first victim of the Southside Slayer, was found in an alley. She was 29 years old and had been shot 3 times in the chest and sexually assaulted. In 1986, Lonnie got married to a woman, and they had 2 children together. In the eyes of his neighbors, Lonnie was a popular person. He had an outgoing personality and often interacted with his neighbors. He was also enthusiastic about his car, which was an orange car with a luxurious interior. In August 1986, the body of 34-year-old Henrietta Wright was discovered under an abandoned mattress. The following year, the remains of 23-year-old Barbara Ware, 26-year-old Bernita Sparks, and Mary Lowe were found. In 1988, the remains of 22-year-old Latricia Jefferson and 18-year-old Alicia Alexander were discovered. All of them were shot to death with a .25 caliber handgun. In November 1988, 30-year-old Enietra Washington was walking down the street on her way to a friend's house. A black man driving an orange Ford Pinto stopped next to her. He offered her a ride, but Washington refused. Then the man said, "That's the problem with you black women. People can't be good to you." Hearing this, she got into the car. The man then took out a pistol, pointed it at Washington's chest, and fired a shot. He also sexually assaulted her. Finally, he threw Washington out of the car, intending for her to bleed to death. Fortunately, Washington managed to get help and survived. She was taken to the hospital, where she described the man's appearance to the police, who then created a composite sketch of the attacker. In May 2007, 25-year-old Janisha Peters was murdered. Through DNA analysis of the evidence left by the killer, the police determined that the perpetrator of Peters' death was related to the Southside Slayer murders that had occurred more than 20 years earlier. In the same year, the Los Angeles Police Department re-established an investigative team to find the killer from that time. In early September 2008, Los Angeles officials announced that they would offer a reward of $500,000 to help capture the perpetrator. In February 2009, the police officially renamed the killer the Grim Sleeper. They also revealed a more alarming piece of information. As early as the 1980s, a man had reported seeing the killer discard a body and provided a detailed description of the killer's car and its license plate number. In March 2009, the only surviving victim of the attack, Washington, gave an interview. She stated that the killer appeared to be a black man in his early 30s. He looked neat, almost eerily so, wearing a black polo shirt and a pair of khaki pants. She also described the interior and exterior of the killer's car. In 2004, voters passed Proposition 69, which required that DNA be collected from all felons and individuals arrested for certain specific charges and entered into a database. This allowed the police to directly identify suspects through technology. Although investigators already had the Grim Sleeper's DNA, there was no record in the database, meaning the killer had not been arrested for other crimes, or if he had been arrested, it was not recorded for some reason. In 2010, the police tried again to enter the Grim Sleeper's DNA into the database. This time, the results were completely different. They found that the DNA of a criminal named Christopher Franklin partially matched that of the Grim Sleeper. Franklin was convicted of felony weapon and drug charges in 2008. He was too young, so the Grim Sleeper could not be him. However, the real identity of the Grim Sleeper must be related to Franklin. So the police set their sights on his father, Lonnie. To avoid alerting the suspect, they first dispatched a police officer disguised as a waiter at a restaurant where Lonnie ate. Then they collected Lonnie's used tableware, silverware, glass, and pizza to obtain his DNA. Eventually, the true identity of the Grim Sleeper was successfully confirmed as 57-year-old Lonnie. On July 7, 2010, Lonnie was arrested. He was charged with 10 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and multiple special circumstances of murder. On December 16th, the Los Angeles Police Department released 180 photos of women found in Lonnie's home. The police chief said, "These people are not suspects. We don't even know if they are victims. But we do know this. Lonnie Franklin's reign of terror in the city of Los Angeles, which spanned well over 2 decades, culminating with almost a dozen murder victims, certainly needs to be investigated further." In total, investigators found over 1,000 photos and several hundred hours of video in Lonnie's home. The images mainly show black women of a wide age range, from teenagers to middle-aged and older, often nude. Some of the victims appear to be beaten and bleeding, while others seem to be unconscious or dead. The police believe Lonnie took many of the photos, which date back up to 30 years. On February 16, 2016, the trial began. Lonnie was charged with 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On May 5th, after nearly 3 months of trial and a day and a half of jury deliberation, he was found guilty of all charges. On May 12th, Lonnie's sentencing hearing began. During the hearing, prosecutors presented evidence related to 4 additional victims they believed were killed by Lonnie. These victims were identified after his arrest: Sharon Alicia Dismuke, Inez Warren, and Georgia Mae Thompson, whose identities were linked to unsolved missing persons cases dating back to 1976 and were considered potential Grim Sleeper victims by the task force. The 4th victim was Relania Morris, who was identified from photos found in Lonnie's home. Her body was never found, and prosecutors did not charge Lonnie with these murders, as they feared it would delay the trial. On June 6, 2016, a Los Angeles County jury sentenced Lonnie to death. On August 10th, the Superior Court sentenced Lonnie on each count and listed the names of the victims. On March 28, 2020, he was found dead in his cell. There were no signs of trauma on his body, and the cause of death and autopsy results were not publicly disclosed. In fact, the police missed an opportunity to apprehend Lonnie earlier. In 2003, he was convicted of a felony and was serving 3 years of supervised probation. In 2004, when voters passed Proposition 69, the police collected and cataloged thousands of DNA samples. During Lonnie's probation, his DNA should have been entered into the database, but it was not, as his probation officer failed to collect it between November 2004 and August 2005.